Let's move over and talk a little bit about some Hart Trophy odds. It still has to pertain to Sidney Crosby because, of course, when we talk Hart Trophy, there's only one player on the Penguins that we're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
But the Penguins enter this year with probably the lowest expectations of the Crosby era. I think that's fair to say. Most are not picking them to make the playoffs. But what are the expectations for Crosby in the national eye? Well, according to Bet Online, not very much. I looked at some of the other sportsbooks as well. They only have like top 10, top 15 in the Hart Trophy odds, and Crosby was nowhere to be found. And it took me getting to Bet Online to find where Sidney Crosby's odds are. As of right now, Sidney Crosby has the 25th highest odds at plus 12,500 to win the Hart Trophy. So if you're a betting person and you want to put a little bit of money on Sidney Crosby, you bet $100, you win 12,500. You bet more, obviously you can do the math. I'm not doing it. I'm not your personal calculator. But he's behind a couple of interesting names. He's behind, as you mentioned, Connor Bedard of the Chicago Blackhawks. That one's not overly crazy to me. But he's also behind Tage Thompson of the Buffalo Sabres. He's behind Mitch Marner of the Toronto Maple Leafs, as well as William Nylander of the Toronto Maple Leafs. Interesting that there are 3 players on the same team that are above Sidney Crosby. That one doesn't quite make sense to me. But he's also behind Igor Shesterkin and Andrei Vasilevsky. Horwat, I told you before the show, the last goaltenders, the only 2 goaltenders to win the league MVP in the National Hockey League in the 21st century, Carey Price in 2015 and Jose Theodore in 2002. And yet there are 2 goaltenders that have higher odds than Sidney Crosby to win the Hart Trophy this year. What did you make of these odds? Because when I saw them, I mean, we had a couple of laughs texting back and forth about who's ahead of him, where he sits. But what were your thoughts when you saw that Sidney Crosby sits at 25th in Hart Trophy odds to start this season?
I kind of get it at first, but then it's like there's a lot of good players in the league right now. It's when you start looking at the names that are ahead of him that you start to ask questions. Mind you, you mentioned 2 goalies. He also has the same odds as a third, if you wanted to count Connor Hellebuck in there.
Yeah.
So this is why I don't understand sports betting. This is why I don't do it. It's fascinating stuff to discuss, though, and fascinating stuff to look at and see how these sports books think the season's going to play out. Essentially, if you really consider it and think about it, this is the way Bet Online ranks the best players in the league. Essentially, putting Crosby way down at 25 is criminal almost. So sure, Igor Shesterkin is good enough to be an MVP caliber goalie, but that's just not the way the cookie crumbles in the NHL. And for the last 2 seasons, at his, I don't want to say advanced age, but as he's aged, Sidney Crosby has done things that, at least early in the year, has forced his way into that MVP conversation. And last season, it lasted a lot longer than I think many expected. But, no, we're not expecting him to win the MVP, but 25 does feel a bit disrespectful and a bit wrong. And, hey, if you think Sid's got that sort of talent left in him and you want to make a ton of money, by all means. You just won't be making that money, but yeah, it's a little low, is it not?
Yeah, no, it is certainly low. And here's the thing that I look at, because obviously, do I expect him to win the Hart Trophy? No. Do I expect him to be in consideration for the Hart Trophy? To a certain extent, yes. And I think the path is very clear and obvious for Sidney Crosby just to get into consideration, just to get into the conversation. You have to lead a fringe team into the playoffs. If he does that, if the Penguins get back into the playoffs for the first time in 2 seasons, 3 seasons, whatever it is, they've missed 2, then he's automatically going to be the reason that they're there, correct? Like, you have to imagine if they get to the playoffs with this roster, Sidney Crosby is reason number 1. So that should get him in consideration alone. But the other thing that gets him there is the 100-point mark. I know a lot of players right now are scoring at 100 points, and I know the MVP is going to go to whoever breaks that record or whoever scores 100 assists or whoever scores 70, 75 goals, because right now there's a lot of talent in the NHL, and when you look at the favorites, and we'll do that in a second, you can see why they're the favorites, right? They have the potential to go out and make history every single season when they step on the ice. The NHL is just flush with talented players right now. But if he gets 100 points, which is going to be an NHL record for 37-year-olds if he can do it, and they get into the playoffs, there's no way he's not a finalist for the Hart Trophy because it's Sidney Crosby. Voters will recognize that. Voters will automatically gravitate towards that. And unless there is history being made around the NHL apart from Crosby, he's going to be the guy that they say, you know what, it's hard to leave him off the ballot. You know, it's hard to not vote for Sidney Crosby, especially if they're not just sneaking in. If they finish top 3 in the Metropolitan Division, Crosby scores 100 points, which again, not out of the realm of possibility. He has had 90 plus points in the last 2 seasons with a average and then absolutely abysmal power play at his disposal. If they have a slightly better power play and he plays with the lead a little bit more often, which is obviously the goal of the Penguins this year, Crosby can get to 100 points. I'm not saying it's possible. I'm saying there is a more than 40% chance that Sidney Crosby can get to 100 points this year. And if he does that, he has to be in consideration, let alone higher than 25th in consideration for the Hart Trophy.
At least higher than 25th. I mean, age is fickle. We know that those young stars are breaking records, setting records, adding their names to history books.
Mm-hmm.
Sidney Crosby has a chance to do the same thing, and that's where it's going to get interesting. That is where he has a chance to set himself apart as well. He's got 2 healthy seasons under his belt already. He's going to come in with a new contract and with a new fire to bring one more season of success to this team. Mm-hmm. And this would be the time to do it because eventually he will start aging out, we'd assume. And even if he doesn't break 100 points, if he gets a point per game, well, there goes that Gretzky record that is now his.
Yeah, true.
So the voters will be looking at that even if he's able to pull something like that off. From beginning to end, he absolutely has a chance to win that sort of the vibes pick, essentially. The vibes pick for MVP. My other question, too, is does anyone remember what Taylor Hall's odds were going into his MVP season? They could not have been good, especially playing with the Devils at the time.
Yeah.
It was Taylor Hall. And then he went on to do what he did. I'm not saying, Crosby's odds are, better or worse than Taylor Hall's, but we've seen crazier MVP award winners, haven't we?
Yeah. I don't know if I'd necessarily compare Taylor Hall going into that season to Sidney Crosby as far as stature and national appeal, but I see where you're going with it. I mean, obviously the MVP voters have caught a lot of backlash for that year and going forward. So I don't know if you're going to see that quite again, just because a player is leading a team into the playoffs that weren't expected to. But I think if you add some of these things together, 1, it being Sidney Crosby, 2, the Penguins being a team that haven't made the playoffs the last 2 years and have consistently kind of gone in a downward trajectory. And 3, if he breaks a couple NHL records, it doesn't hurt either. So I think that 25th is crazy. I think that some of the names, Tage Thompson is good. The Buffalo Sabres might be good, but above Crosby going into the season with the opportunity that Crosby has to really put together a MVP type package, I don't see it. So with that, let's close out this segment by looking at the favorites. Because we talked about Crosby, clearly he should be higher than 25th. Clearly, that's a good, a good long shot bet to just stash away in your pocket for the NHL season if you want to throw a little bit on it. Of course, it's your money. You do what you want, and of course, always gamble responsibly.